Ever find yourself in a conversation about U.S. immigration and suddenly, like, everyone at the table's an expert?
Hmm.
Happens to me all the time. It's just one of those topics, right? Tons of strong opinions, but how much of what we think we know is actually, backed up by facts?
Right.
You clearly had this in mind when you handed me this stack of stuff. We've got reports, articles,
Hmm.
even some pretty deep philosophical stuff in here.
Hmm.
So we're doing that deep dive today, ditching the emotional arguments and getting into the hard data, the historical context, all of it.
Yeah.
So our listeners can actually make up their own minds.
It's really crucial to go back to those primary sources because, I mean, immigration gets talked about in such broad strokes, but it's way more complicated than people realize.
Totally. Like even just going through this report from migrationpolicy.org, frequently requested statistics on immigrants, some of this stuff was honestly news to me.
Yeah. Like what?
Well, I always pictured the U.S. as having like this huge percentage of immigrants today, nation of immigrants, that whole idea. But get this, the peak was actually back in 1890.
1890. Yeah, that's right. Back then, immigrants were almost 15% of the population, 14.8% to be exact. Today, it's lower, closer to 13.9%.
Wow. See, I had no idea. So it's not like immigration is new to America. It's just the story's more complicated than everyone comes here now.
Exactly. It's always been this ebb and flow going way back.
Okay, so that's one mind-blown moment, but here's another one. Apparently, most immigrants coming in recently, they've actually got college degrees.
It's true. And that has huge implications, right? I mean, it changes who we think of when we picture an immigrant. And we're not just talking about people filling certain jobs, but this influx of highly educated folks impacting tons of industries.
So it's not just how many are coming in, but the skills they're bringing with them.
Exactly.
This report you gave me about the economics of it all is that where it gets into how immigrants are actually contributing, even if they're undocumented.
That's a key point right there. You said documented and undocumented. It's crucial to make that distinction because they're often lumped together, but their experiences are totally different legally and otherwise.
Right, of course. So let's break that down. What's the data actually say about undocumented immigrants, specifically when it comes to the economy? Because there's a lot of, well, let's say, strong opinions out there about it.
Right.
But it rarely feels like those opinions line up with, actual evidence.
Yeah. And there's a lot of misinformation, frankly, out there. This report you shared, though, from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it kind of lays it all out. One of those things that people get wrong constantly is about undocumented immigrants and the welfare system. Like they're a drain on it.
Right.
Which is not true at all.
Yeah.
They actually contribute billions in taxes every year to systems that they can't even necessarily benefit from.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
And on top of that, think about the roles that they fill so often. Agriculture, construction, service industries. Those are jobs that we have chronic labor shortages in.
Yeah.
Essential to the economy, even if they're not always, front of mind.
Right. It's like this whole workforce that we don't even realize is there keeping things running.
Exactly.
And it's interesting. We're talking about the economics, but this whole conversation gets into like bigger questions too, right? About like national identity and what it even means to be American.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And that's where I think this paper that you pulled is so fascinating. Re-examining the philosophical underpinnings of the melting pot versus multiculturalism
Yeah.
in the current immigration debate in the United States.
It's a mouthful.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but it gets at these like core ideas that have shaped not just policy, but also how America sees itself.
So break that down for me. What are we talking about with this whole melting pot versus multiculturalism thing?
Yeah.
Because I feel like I hear those terms, but I'm not sure I could actually explain the difference.
Right. So the melting pot is like everyone comes here and we all assimilate into this big American pot.
Right.
Right. You leave your old ways behind and you become American.
Like a stew. Everyone just blends together.
Exactly like a stew. But what the paper points out is that hasn't actually been applied fairly historically.
Right.
While European immigrants were kind of absorbed in this melting pot, other groups like African Americans, Native Americans, they were excluded.
It's like there were very specific rules about who got to melt and how.
Exactly. And that's where multiculturalism comes in. It's less about everyone being the same and more about like appreciating those differences.
Right.
So think of it more like a mosaic or a salad bowl.
Okay.
Where the individual pieces, they retain their own unique flavor, but they add to this like bigger, more vibrant whole.
I like that visual.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not about erasing the differences, it's that they make it more interesting.
Right. And the paper argues that, especially since the 60s,
Hmm.
with more diversity, this multicultural perspective has become more accepted.
Makes sense.
Like, America is changing, and a single fixed identity is less relevant, maybe, than a shared set of values.
Okay, so that actually ties back to what you were saying earlier about shifting demographics.
Yes.
I was looking at this Pew Research Center report
Mm-hmm.
about where immigrants to the U.S. come from.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting to see how different it is today versus like a century ago.
Yeah, it's really a huge shift. Like, for so long, when we pictured an immigrant, it was someone from Europe. But today, the majority are coming from Mexico, India, China. The Philippines, El Salvador, Vietnam are right behind them.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah.
And that's not just about the numbers, that's changing what communities look like.
Yeah, schools, workplaces.
So it's like the melting pot, even if it was ever accurate,
Right.
it's becoming something totally different.
It's much more complex.
And I imagine with all that change comes challenges.
Right,
Like-
definitely. And one that jumps out, you included this in the stack,
Yeah.
is what happens to people who are in this kind of immigration limbo,
Mhm.
where they have temporary protection, but no clear path like residency or citizenship.
Right, this whole twilight status thing.
Exactly. DACA recipients, TPS, it's a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's not like a small group. It's a significant chunk of the population.
And it's growing. I mean, this other article you shared in the Twilight Zone, record number of U.S. immigrants are in limbo statuses. It's wild.
It really is. Because it's like they're trying to build a life on shifting sand,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
You're here, you're working, you're paying taxes, you might have a family,
Mm.
but you always have this fear.
The uncertainty is huge.
Exactly.
And that's where I think the policy conversation has to move beyond, just the economics or the national identity and really look at the human cost. Because these are real people with hopes and dreams and families.
Yeah, it's a heavy thing to confront.
Yeah.
And knowing that you're wanted but not fully welcomed,
Mm-hmm.
you're contributing, but you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine.
It got to take a toll.
So I'm curious, as someone who's obviously, really deep in this world, what are your thoughts on where we go from here?
Yeah.
Because it does feel like we're kind of stuck.
Yeah, it's tough because it's so complex.
Right.
But I do think there are ways forward.
Yeah.
And it starts with shifting how we talk about it.
What do you mean?
So instead of this being one giant problem to solve, we need to acknowledge that this is a million experiences all at once.
Right.
We talked about the economic stuff. We talked about these philosophical debates.
Yeah.
And then the human stories, right? We can't forget about those. And each one of those things adds another layer.
Another layer of complexity.
Exactly. So anything that's going to try to tackle immigration has to take all of that into account.
So it's about ditching the simple narrative and getting into the weeds, which feels like a huge ask, to be honest.
It is a huge ask, but
Yeah.
I think more and more people are realizing that what we're doing isn't working.
Right.
So then the question becomes, how do we move forward in a way that makes sense in a global world, but
Yeah.
also reflects, the values that we say we have?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's one that I think we're going to have to keep unpacking as we keep going here. It's interesting because when you say broken system, it's not like there's one quick fix, right? We've got decades of this melting pot idea, the reality of a much more multicultural society now. And then on top of that, these really specific policy things to figure out, like twilight status. It's a lot.
It is. And that's actually, I think, what makes this paper, re-examining the philosophical underpinnings, so useful. It doesn't try to give these easy answers, but it does make you think differently about the whole debate.
Okay, so if we're not looking for easy answers, what would a different approach even look like? It's one thing to say, let's fix it, but how do we go from there to actual action?
Well, they highlight a few things. One is education. And not just for, integrating immigrants, but giving them the tools to really succeed economically. So we're not just being nice, we're acknowledging that their success helps everyone.
Instead of this fear that they're taking something away?
Exactly. It's a win-win, really. And it connects to this idea of thinking globally, not just nationally. We can't act like immigration's just about our borders. People are leaving their own countries for reasons, right? Economic hardship, political instability, climate change.
Push and pull factors.
Right. And that's why I thought that Pew Research report was so interesting, the one about where U.S. immigrants come from now. If we actually understand those reasons, those patterns, maybe we can make policies that make more sense.
So instead of reacting to a problem, we're getting ahead of it.
Exactly. And those policies, they've got to cover everything, a path to legal status for undocumented folks who are already here contributing. And then on the other end, a better system for those high-skilled workers we need. It's about fairness and practicality.
Which is where that twilight status thing feels so urgent, honestly. Because these are people, often brought here as kids, who are stuck. They're American in every way, but on paper.
Exactly. And it just highlights that human cost of not doing anything. You know, these are people thriving in their communities, but with this fear hanging over them. DREAM Act, broader reform that needs to be a priority.
It's about seeing them, right? Like actually acknowledging they exist and deserve a chance. And, it goes back to what you were saying before about ditching the simple narrative. It's so easy to get lost in the statistics, the policy stuff, but it's about people, ultimately.
100%. If we can remember that, if we can listen with some empathy, actually try to learn from each other, then maybe we can have a real conversation about it.
Well, that's a good note to end on, I think. We've gone through a lot today: history, current events, the whole philosophical side of U.S. immigration. We've looked at the numbers, the big ideas, but also those human stories that sometimes get lost. There's no easy solutions, but at least we're starting to ask the right questions.
And that's huge.
It is. To everyone listening, hopefully you're walking away with a little more knowledge, maybe some new questions of your own, because at the end of the day, figuring out the future of immigration, it's on all of us.